welcome to Molecules to Mindset, the podcast where science meets everyday life. I'm your host, Ivani Verma, and together we'll explore the fascinating ways science and healthcare touch every part of our lives. From the molecules that make up our bodies to the thoughts and attitudes that shape our experiences, we're here to dive into it all. Every episode, I'll tackle topics that matter to you, breaking down complex scientific concepts into something that you can relate and use. We'll chat with experts, share real-life stories, and discover how health and science are not just topics for researchers and doctors, but integral parts of our daily lives. Whether you're looking to understand more about your own health, interested in the latest scientific discoveries, or just curious about how the world works, Molecules to Mindset has something for you. So today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Kirkiles, a dedicated and experienced immunologist. So Dr. Kirkiles has over 20 years of expertise in cellular and antibody-mediated research, particularly in the areas of transplant immunology, autoimmunity, and inflammation. She began her academic journey at the University of Connecticut, where she earned a BA in biology with an emphasis in cell biology, followed by a PhD in nutritional biochemistry. She holds a master's degree in animal and nutritional sciences from the University of New Hampshire as well. Throughout her career, Dr. Kirkiles has seamlessly transitioned from academia to industry, bringing a wealth of knowledge and practical insights into both fields. Her work has significantly contributed to our understanding of complex immunological processes and implications for health and disease. In addition to her scientific pursuits, Dr. Kirkiles owns Weekend Kitchen, which is a store located in Essex, Connecticut, and it offers unique new and vintage cooking items such as including cooking classes, with top chefs. She also recently has become interested in health coaching on the side. So we're excited to dive into her experiences, learn about research, and discuss the current trends and future directions in immunology. Dr. Kirkiles, thank you so much for joining with us today. Welcome to the show. To start, maybe could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your journey, and what initially sparked your interest in science?
Sure. So my career has sort of gone in a circular pattern of what I was really passionate about when I was a kid, which was nutrition. I've been a vegetarian since I was 15, so that's like 45 years.
Wow.
And it all sort of stemmed because my father had a heart attack when he was very young. And so we were always very mindful of what we ate for health, which of course now is a completely a beautiful thing, as food is medicine, and food can sort of nourish your soul as well as your body and keep you from getting a chronic disease.
Right.
So when I was an undergrad, I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and study nutrition, but I didn't want to be a dietitian because I was really into the sort of hardcore science thing, and I didn't really want to sit and tell people, no, don't eat this, don't eat that, and do a hospital internship and everything. I was like, I already went to college. I don't need to do that too. In retrospect, I should have done that. But one of those things that you kind of look back 20 years and go, that would have been a good idea had I done that. But so I studied nutrition as a molecule in a rigorous program of looking at carotenoids, which are like beta carotene, and they're really potent antioxidants. And I really got fascinated by colorful vegetables. So, and this was sort of in the infancy of all of the antioxidants, polyphenols, and free radicals. And so I did my master's and my PhD studying carotenoids. And then I thought I would go on to do my postdoc at Yale. And my undergraduate, or I guess my graduate and my undergraduate was at, land-grant college, which is not affiliated with a medical school. So the opportunities were a little bit limited in terms of what you could explore. And then I got to Yale as a postdoc in immunology, and I thought, this is great. Everybody told me to do something different for my postdoc because you sort of link things along, and sometimes I think you're really not in full control of what happens to your career. You kind of slide along from one thing to another, and you're young and you really don't know what you want to do, or I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew that nutrition and immunology must be inherently linked together. And the microbiome was not what it is now. I mean,
Right.
had I done that now, I would have gone into studying the microbiome and how it relates. But I ended up in a transplant immunology lab.
Mhm.
Whose emphasis is on vascular biology. So we studied the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels and how the immune system interacted with it.
Mhm.
And I did that in Jordan Pober's lab. And Jordan is a very world famous vascular biologist.
Mhm.
And it was nice to be in a big lab with all sorts of other people, and you sort of gain knowledge from your coworkers. And you also, as a postdoc and as a graduate student, you form lifelong bonds with these people
Right.
because you're going through sort of a similar thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, even 20 something years out, I'm still texting every day with three of my postdoc friends,
That's great.
which is which is really wonderful that you can keep
Yeah.
these ties together.
Mhm.
So I kind of forget about my my graduate work, and because my postdoc was just such a wonderful experience there. I went to medical school. I had different opportunities.
Mhm.
I started in xenotransplantation,
Mhm.
which was to put pig organs into people,
Mhm.
which now, I guess, in the last couple of months, they put some genetically modified pig organs into people, and they didn't live very long. I think they lived 2 months, but you got to start
Mhm.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And that sort of morphed into allograft, so human things. So I I guess it's sort of a nice link to think that you can merge eventually your beginning um, studies with your later studies.
Mhm. Yeah, like, do you think that you felt like maybe because, you had several different experiences that were, kind of linked, like you're saying, but weren't exactly the exact same field? So do you
Right.
feel like you had to learn how to adapt to the labs that you were currently working in for your postdoc versus graduate studies? Like, how did you manage that adaptation? Did you do a lot of self-studying, or like what led you to do that?
Well, switching gears, you do a lot of reading, and anytime you switch a field, there's always more background things, and you have to get up to speed. There's a learning curve for everything.
Yeah.
So there's always people in the lab that can be your mentor. And then,
Okay.
of course, lab meetings where Jordan would direct things. But so I fell into this niche of making humanized mice.
Hmm.
This was long before it became the vogue thing that with Jackson Lab and everything. Um, so it was my job to take these immunodeficient mice and then um, reconstitute them with human immune cells. And what I
Hmm.
would also do was put human skin on them.
Hmm.
So it was a skin graft model.
Okay.
So now in my current job, which I guess we'll talk about later, I
Sure.
do pretty much the same thing, but instead of skin, I put tumors on them. So
Mhm.
even though you change fields, you don't sort of change your whole life. So the knowledge builds on itself.
Yeah.
And then in the back of your mind, you always have sort of that passion project or that passion thing.
Mhm.
So even though I wasn't working in nutrition, I was always interested in the nutritional literature and
Right.
what was going on with that kind of thing. I really felt that 20 something years ago, research in the nutrition world wasn't really where it is with like molecular biology and all of this
Mhm.
stuff. It really wasn't hardcore science type things that I knew that I could do elsewhere.
Right. So you feel like it advanced a lot in the past 20 years or so compared to what it
Yeah,
was
yeah, and it's
originally?
still very like nutritional research is like trying to get people. A lot of it is sort of big meta studies, databases of what people
Mhm.
eat and this and
Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
So wasn't really interested in doing that kind of stuff.
You are more interested in like the actual wet lab experiences rather than more clinical? Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
I see.
I guess I would say that.
Okay. So from now that we're talking about your experience in academia, I wanted to ask, what were some of like the most memorable experiences in your time of working in academia? I know that you said you really liked some of the bonds that you had made with some of the other postdocs, and that's great. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit more, or talk about even some challenges too that you faced. But maybe first we can start off with the memorable experiences and then work our way.
I guess I don't know. There's like so many. I was there for so long, but
Yeah, right.
so it's the people that you meet, the relationships that you make with them. I really
Mhm.
enjoyed teaching the MD PhD students that would come through the lab because eventually, if you stay there long enough, I ended up being the lab manager,
Okay,
and so I also had administrative responsibilities. I would write
Mhm.
all of the protocols and stuff for the human and the animal work. But you become sort of a mentor to all of the kids that are coming along, and you sort of
Right.
take and nurture them. So you would sort of be, well, I was deemed the lab mother once. That wasn't what I really wanted to be, but
But that's great that like others felt like they could look up to you or ask you for help. Because for my own experience, like working in a lab, I know that sometimes like with some protocols, it can be so complicated that you can't figure it out on your own
right,
looking at
right.
that first looking at it for the first time. So I'm sure they appreciated having like a lab mother, like you said, to ask questions to. I know I would. We have an amazing research assistant in our lab, Dr. Namkung, who's great. So I'm sure everyone appreciated that. What were some of like the challenges that you faced? Did you find it was challenging to adapt from just working in the lab as a postdoc to transitioning to a lab manager, or did you find that transition to be okay?
That part was pretty easy.
So you didn't find it to be very challenging though? Like it wasn't like a lot more duties than you were used to?
Um, well, it was in terms of writing all of the protocols and stuff
Right.
and then keeping track of the grants, but it was something that I'm always a multitasker. I've never only had one job.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to um, take on extra responsibilities, I always feel that don't be a one-trick pony. There's so
Mm-hmm.
many people in labs that all they do is that one assay over and over and over again. And they
Mm-hmm.
get, I mean, it might be slightly nuanced, but they don't do anything else. So
Mm-hmm.
if you want to move on in the world, you need to have as many tools in your toolkit as you can possibly have.
Right.
So the fact that I managed a lab and did all of these other things sort of led into other roles in other company in the company that I'm in now.
Okay.
So I think that's helpful. I also sat on the IRB, the Institutional Review Board.
Mm-hmm.
So I once a month would go and review clinical trials and
Oh,
other
wow.
protocols for the university. And that put me in touch with other physicians and scientists and really other disciplines that I wouldn't have been exposed to
Mm-hmm.
before. It was kind of a lot of work to try to go through the protocols and
Right.
figure out whether or not they needed to be augmented and or if were they taking too much blood from the people coming through the
Mm-hmm.
clinical trial? So I felt it was really fascinating and really helped me bridge the sort
Right.
of lab bench to the clinical part, which you
That's
sort
really
of
interesting.
lose if you're just a bench scientist. Like
Yeah.
even I was part of human and translational immunology. You
Mhm.
didn't really see the patient part.
That's really interesting. Do you feel like the physicians that you collaborated with were, able to vocalize really what the patient's needs were, if they had issues with like therapeutic adherence to specific drug, maybe while you were able to tell them about the current innovations that were going on in the field. Do you feel like by having this opportunity to work at the IRB, it fostered that connection between the two?
I think so, because you had to really look and keep the patient in mind to make sure that what they were doing was sort of ethically appropriate.
Mhm. Yeah.
Although you didn't ever see any of the patients. I
Hmm.
also worked on a clinical trial
Hmm.
that we did in the transplant department with Alexion and looking at one of their therapeutics to see if it worked in the transplant setting.
Right.
So what I would do is, and this was fun because it was different than my regular humanized mice thing.
Yeah.
So I would get the patient biopsies and
Mm.
work those up. Um, so
That's
I
really
would work with
interesting.
the people, but so when you're doing sort of that kind of clinical work, you'd be all set to receive this biopsy and then the patient wouldn't show up
Mm,
or,
yeah,
or
that's
something. So there was always like some sort of conflict because you're dealing with humans that don't really
right.
necessarily want to have a kidney biopsy today. So,
Yeah, for sure. Like I can even attest from my experience, like I'm so lucky to be working on cells because I don't have to worry about any of those things. But I guess those are some of the precautions you have to worry about when you're working with actual patients. That's very true. No, I
and
think
sometimes your cells don't grow the way you think that they're
exactly, or they can become contaminated. Yep, there's lots of factors.
right, right.
Um, so I think that was really interesting, like hearing about that collaboration, because I do think that even from my own experience, there is like a bit of a disconnect between MDs and PhDs. So
Mhm.
I found that that's so nice that you're able to bridge that gap and communicate with them because I think we all have so much to learn from each other, whether it is at the lab bench or whether it's working with patients, and we can all benefit and improve the field of medical knowledge for
Mhm.
everyone that way. So that's great. Um, Switching the gears a little bit, I wanted to also ask about your transition to industry.
Mhm.
So first off, like what motivated you to make the change that you did working in from academia to industry? And what are like some of the differences that you notice between the two fields in
Okay. So,
terms of research and collaboration, if you could
mm.
explain, please?
so when I finished my postdoc, I sort of dabbled to try to find a job in industry.
Okay.
Um, but it was a time where in Connecticut, and I really didn't want to move because I'd already sort of established myself, that all of the biotech was leaving the state.
Mm,
So I was I was thinking, oh well, this is not so good. So I would go to some interviews, and then I was working with those humanized mouse models,
mhm,
and it was long before they became sort of commonplace. So I remember going to a couple of interviews and them saying, oh, yeah, no, that's too complicated. Like they wanted you to come into the job already doing whatever it was that they wanted, whatever the model was. But I was like,
mhm.
well, I learned that. I could learn this.
Yeah.
So after a few of those tries and the fact that I always lost out to somebody that already had industry experience. So how do you get industry experience
Uh,
unless you work in industry? I
right.
collaborated with industry, but that wasn't the same because it's a completely different mindset.
Okay.
So after a while, I kind of thought, oh, let me just stay here. It's a nice, stable environment.
Mhm,
So that's why I stayed so long in academia. However, if you stay too long in academia, they think, oh, she can't transition. It'll be too hard.
mhm,
But it got to the point where um, Jordan is in his 70s now that they don't want, the NIH doesn't want to fund these older investigators, even though I think that they're still very valuable
right.
training the younger kids, I call them. Um, so we started to lose grant funding, even
Mhm,
though the grants were beautifully written and everything.
mhm,
And then COVID hit.
right.
And so if you work on humanized mouse models, you can't get any of the human parts
Mhm,
put in the mice.
yeah.
So I thought this was a good opportunity for me to test the waters again
Mhm,
and see if I could find anything in this area. So a friend of mine had gotten a job at Abcam, which is an antibody development company.
mhm,
And I had used a lot of Abcam antibodies in my histology. So I applied for the job and they had opened up sort of an outpost in one town over from Yale. So it was an easy commute for me. I didn't have to move anywhere.
mhm,
So I got the job at Abcam, and then I felt so guilty about abandoning Jordan after 24 years of being his lab manager.
right.
But I thought it was the right thing to do at the time.
Mhm,
So that would give me, I knew it would give me some industry experience.
mhm,
And from there, if I didn't like it, then I could move on. So the transition was a little bit of a rocky road because
right.
it wasn't true research. So here I am spending my whole life at the bench,
Mhm,
and this was more like validating the antibodies that came through their pipeline. And it
mhm,
was, to me, it was very disconnected.
mhm,
So when you're a postdoc or a research scientist, you
Yeah.
pretty much do everything. You got to be your own person, and
Mhm.
you take the thought from the start, from the finish. There's a hypothesis, you design experiments, and they may or may not work, and then you write them up and you publish them, and off you go. And you're on to the next thing.
Mhm.
Here, it was very much a business.
Mhm.
And um, and during COVID, you couldn't really go and hang out for the day
Yeah.
and find out if, how everything was. And I didn't realize there was only about 4 PhDs there, and the rest were associate scientists. And um, and it was very fragmented. Some of the company was in England, and some of the company was here.
Wow.
And
Okay.
you didn't do your thing from the start to the finish. So
Mhm.
so you would have like a list of 100 different antibodies that you were going to have to screen,
Mhm.
but instead of you determining what the tissues were that you would screen them on, somebody else did that.
Okay, so you felt like, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
It was a
So,
disconnect for me. So you
right.
couldn't really grab onto anything that was
Mhm.
scientifically relevant.
Yeah.
And you didn't have time. You didn't have time to if you thought it was a really interesting compound like tau or something in Alzheimer's, so you would try to scramble and get a piece of brain tissue to test it on,
Right.
but you wouldn't learn anything about it because there
Mm.
wasn't the time to invest in that because it was all about the metrics. It
So
was
like you think that with industry it was more like, finishing certain tasks compared to working in academia where you had like a little bit more room for self-discovery.
mhm.
Okay. I see.
Yeah.
That's really
And not every company is like that. But
Mhm.
this one just happened to be. And I
Right.
realized after I had gotten there that it was really not a good fit for me
Right.
because I managed a lab of 12 people. I had a manager
Mhm.
who was going to tell me what to do. And these spreadsheets that I never had to deal with before. So, and all of these dashboards and metrics and everything. And I knew immediately that it really wasn't going to be my long-term solution.
Mhm. Okay.
And everybody who had been there started to leave.
Oh,
So
okay.
year and a half that I was there, 30 people out of this company
Wow.
cycled through.
That's a lot. Yeah.
It is a lot. Yeah.
Wow.
So one day there was one of the associate scientists said, oh, it was her last day. And I said, where are you going? And she said, a startup company in New Haven called Normunity.
Right.
And I said, they're looking for anybody else? She says, well,
Yeah.
there's only 3 people. So yeah, probably. So and she sent me a link to the um, job description on Indeed. So I immediately ran back to my desk and I had my CV all written up anyway. And I quickly wrote a cover letter and I fired it off. And then that evening I got a call that they wanted to interview me.
That was fast.
So
Wow.
yeah, when you only have a company of 3 people and you need
I
to fill it,
guess.
pretty.
Yeah.
And I had one other interview while I was at ABCAM at another cancer-related company. So even if you bomb out of one interview, I think you learn where your deficits are. So because I'm not an immuno-oncologist, and I sort of aimed high on at a job description that was above my
I
my
see.
my grade. So I had a lovely interview, but I really realized where I needed to beef up my knowledge of immuno-oncology. So I spent, before the actual interview, I spent a lot of time going through the literature and at least getting the keywords and phrases and what drugs were on the market.
So
Uh,
that's it. That brings up an interesting point because if any other viewers are watching this and are interested into going into like an industry job, like you're saying, and the requirements don't totally fit what they've
mhm.
done previously, do you think that they're still able to apply for a job like that through reading through the literature, or do you think it's better to actually have like prior lab experience like dealing with that specific field?
I think you're not going to always have everything on their list
Okay.
because like this had proliferation assays. I done many proliferation assays, but I
Mhm.
didn't do their proliferation assay.
I see. Hmm.
So I think I think as long as you have the basic concepts and the motivation to do the job, then I don't know, every hiring manager is different. They have a whole bunch of
Yeah.
checkpoints that they have to deal with.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, that's interesting. Like, I was also going to ask, going back to an earlier point you made, you said, it's hard to gain a job in industry
Hmm,
because you don't have any prior experience
right.
in industry. So, what would you recommend to those that are interested in going into industry? Would you recommend like doing like a summer research project there if you can, or is there something that people can do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what, if you're talking about a master's level or a PhD level position.
Either or.
So I think you could be a summer intern during your undergrad years. I think that would be helpful. I think if you're a postdoc, I would recommend doing an academic postdoc for a couple of years and then do an industrial postdoc, which I was going to do. I had it all set up, but I was talked out of it. So just getting a little bit of industry experience,
Hmm.
I think is helpful if you want to really transition to industry full time. And there's a lot of industrial postdocs.
Right, I see. One of the other questions too that I was wanting to ask was when you transitioned from academia to industry, what was like some of the biggest challenges that you experienced? I know you said, maybe having like specific tasks and limited like ability for self-discovery was one of them. Like, but what were some of the other challenges or maybe not challenges, but advantages or things that you liked about industry that academia could not offer?
So once I got to Normunity, which is so it's a startup company. So I was employee number 7. We're now up to 12 people.
Mhm.
So there, we're affiliated with an academic lab. So everything is back to research as usual.
Mhm.
And the difference between um, my job now and my academic position is just the sort of the direction and the scale of everything and the pace.
Mm.
So everything is very fast paced.
Mm.
Um, in academia, you're doing stuff on the grants that you might have one of the aims that somebody has written into a grant that was funded. So your project would be one of those specific aims.
Mhm.
And in industry, if you're again, and it all depends on if you're in a startup or if you're in big pharma. So I'm in a biotech company that we're not publicly traded or anything. So we have an advisory board, and we have venture capital that has given us millions of dollars to get this target to the clinic.
Mhm.
So we're beholden to our board members.
Mhm.
So every quarter, you got to deliver the goods because they want the return on the investment. Because again, it's a business. They've put in $65 million. They want to make their money back.
Mhm.
So you don't have the luxury of, when you get to a academic lab, you get a project. So you might spend 6 months kind of figuring out how you're going to do the
Yeah.
model or whatever, the cell-based assay, the animal
Optimizing
study,
it and everything.
optimizing it. We don't have that time to optimize.
Yeah.
We went in with one compound at risk. So everything we did was a risk that it wouldn't pan out. And eventually we had to pause that part of the project and move something else up. So you can't be married to your molecule either.
Interesting.
So
Mhm.
like um like when I was at Yale and I had to study, how the immune system attached the vasculature here,
Mhm.
it's like you got one compound, you work through that, and if it doesn't work, you're on to the next one.
Right.
So just when you figure out that you've gotten up to speed with your new with your new stuff, you got to read about the next thing.
Yeah.
But it's fun because the pace is fast and you do pivot really fast and
Mhm.
you're compensated better than in academia,
Mhm.
which is always a lovely thing.
Yeah,
I'm
for
not
sure.
used to getting a bonus. It's like my bonus used to be a box of pears. It's like, okay, well, now we got money.
I guess,
So,
yeah, I guess that makes it interesting though, right? Because there's always more things to discover and more things to like try out. I mean, sometimes like when you're given a grant, I guess maybe it's not as like time pressure, like you're not under the same pressure, but like
Right.
maybe it sounds like from what you're saying, you kind of almost thrive on the pressure, like trying new
Well,
things,
it's
which
exhilarating
yeah.
to think if something's really going well, or
Mm.
and if you're in a really small company like I am, I mean, Discover rather than this Discovery, there's only six of us, so it's a lot of work for six
Yeah,
people.
I
So we
bet.
don't do it in a vacuum. So I have so I'm a senior research scientist. There's another girl that just finished her postdoc. And so we do the animal work together because in academia, I could handle 20 or 25 mice. Now we're doing 70 mice.
Wow.
So the scale is bigger, the
Yeah.
stakes are higher.
Yeah.
We have more money to buy reagents, which is nice. Although I still have an academic mind. It's like, can I save $20 on
Yeah.
this? Because I can't get that out of my head. Because, um, but we all work as a group because you have a common goal,
Mhm.
not just your aim and in the grant.
Yeah. So like
So
do you find like there's more like collaboration between each other like in the industry compared to academia where like it's more self-directed?
exactly, exactly. Like because now we go to the academic labs, lab meetings,
Mhm.
and I'll like scratch my head and think, well, why didn't someone tell her not to do it that way? Whereas here we don't have that time. It's like we
Right.
all work together. We have one guy that is really great at designing antibodies, and we're making um, bispecific antibodies and antibody drug conjugates,
Mhm.
which is all new to me, which is great. So even though I don't have a background in that, there's tons of literature. So reading again is how you learn, and asking questions, and um, they I haven't gone to any meetings recently, but they'll go to meetings and bring back information about what other groups are doing and how to tweak our system to be more optimized in the short time frame that we have to run them.
Right. It seems like from listening to you speak, it sounds like if I'm not wrong, one of the most like important traits, sorry, in industry is being adaptable. And it seems like the field is ever changing. You
Yep.
have to move quite fast. You're
Yep.
working with others, and maybe like you guys have to, by working together, you can figure out where each person's strong suit lies,
Correct.
and then, delegate them to the roles that they're best suited for. Um, that sounds very interesting. I hadn't heard of it from that perspective before.
Because
Um,
even when I was hired, I told them all about the humanized mice thing, but we didn't have any plans to doing any of these experiments in-house
mm,
with in our lab. But since I had the expertise with these models and all of the histology experience, this is why I filled that role.
yeah.
Because usually, um, so a lot of these pharmaceutical or biotech companies, because having a vivarium with the animals there's no vivariums. So that's why this link with this academic lab is so crucial,
Mm,
that we keep animals at Yale.
okay, I see.
And so that's why I've been able to do all of this work. But a lot of the work we farm out to a contract research organization or a CRO.
Mhm.
And so Vivian, my colleague that does the animal stuff with me, and I will do the pilot studies. So we'll do proof of principle because we're cheaper than a CRO. So um, so we send that, and it could cost 150 or $200,000 for that group to do the work that they do.
Right.
Try to have it slightly different than what we did, but the same principle, and they test our compounds. So we make our own therapeutic compounds that we have to go test them in the animal models so that we know that they work. And there's different formulations, and some will work better than others, some won't work at all. So
Mhm.
you sort of drill down to the best one. Same thing
Right.
with the histology, because we wanted to have our own uh, antibody so we could screen patients. And so you need a biomarker.
Hmm.
So it's interesting, and it's really fun. I really think that the switch was
Hmm.
um, a good fit for me with this particular company
Right.
because I fill a niche and I feel good that I can provide this service for them.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like it was a nice change of pace for you because I was also wondering too, this might be a naive question, since I'm in academia, not industry, but like, have you heard, or do you know about any of the differences, between like smaller companies like your startup versus bigger companies in terms of culture and in terms of like expectation? Um,
Mhm.
like, what are some of those differences that someone can expect?
So a startup is high risk.
Okay,
Um, so they live and die by their investors. And if you don't come up with something and you have a very few things in your pipeline because you're new,
right.
and of course you're not given there's no formulations department, there's you do everything.
Limited
There's
resources, since
Yeah. So in a company like Pfizer, I have a friend at Pfizer, and big pharma,
right.
they have their culture already established. Instead
Mm.
of like biotech, we did everything from designing the logo to the website. We're all involved in that. So it's really ground up type
Yeah,
thing.
whereas big pharma's maybe more bureaucratic.
Yeah. And you have to figure out what your culture wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
So
Like whatever
that's
fit
the
to your.
difference. We're planning on doing some team building things
That's
this
great.
year to
That's
try
great.
to build a cohesive
Hmm.
group.
That's super important. Yeah.
Yeah, I know in my cooking school, we do a lot of team building events, and Pfizer is one of because there's a branch of it up the street that they often will send people, and it sort of levels the playing field of, who's the boss, who's the technician, or who's the administrator, and it doesn't even matter.
Yeah,
So everyone
exactly.
sort of gets a nice feel for.
Yeah, for sure. Because maybe there can be like, I don't know if stigmatization is the right word, but like differences based on like someone's level. So it's really nice if you guys can all come together and do a nice activity like a cooking class or something like that.
Right, right, right.
That's,
And it's nice in a small company. You don't feel as threatened by the CEO.
hmm.
Um, sprinkles fairy dust all the time, and she's very positive and wants to make sure that everybody is happy and doing and productive. Because if you're not happy, you're not productive.
For sure.
With only 6 people doing the, discovery, productivity is big, but don't have a dashboard. We don't have to keep track of our time.
Yeah, that's really interesting though, to hear about because I only hear so much about academia, so it's really interesting to hear about industry. Um, just like a general question, um, for viewers who don't know, um, is there a specific background that you should have when going into industry, or are you eligible, straight off a bachelor's degree? Like I know it might depend from like place to place, but like
Yeah.
generally, like are there any requirements?
Well, I think it's easier to get a job if you have a bachelor's or a master's degree.
Mhm.
Once you get into the PhD level, I think it gets a little harder to because there's less openings.
Okay. Why are there less openings as you progress in as a PhD student?
Well, when they have to pay more, and
So it gets more expensive, I see.
that and one PhD might have 2 or 3 associate scientists working for them.
Mm,
So the just the level of work can be on the lower end
right.
filled
So
by
I,
these.
so I need to bring in more people if PhD students are on board, like, compared to like a master's or bachelor level.
Yeah, because I know when Abcam closed the branch, they actually got bought out by Danaher, which is a company that owns Leica, which do the microscopes and things. So all of the people that had masters and lower easily found jobs at Alexion and other local companies,
Right.
whereas some of the PhD scientists are having a harder time
Mm,
finding something else. It's all
Mm,
about the job market and, you
yeah.
know, the openings that they have at different companies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess yeah, it's case to case. That's interesting though to hear. I was wondering if we could shift gears another, and I just want to ask generally, it doesn't have to be super technical, but since you work in the field of immunology, what do you see as like the biggest challenge in your field, and how can researchers and professionals best prepare to address those challenges?
So immunology is a really vast topic of, even though there's, finite numbers of players in the immune system, but
Mhm.
it incorporates itself in many different disciplines from, the inflammatory effect to COVID was huge with the immune. So everybody understood a cytokine storm after a while. And so everybody was an immunologist during COVID.
Yeah.
Um, so in my field of immuno-oncology, it's a relatively new field. So for years, the standard of care was radiation and chemotherapy,
Mhm.
same drug, same discipline. And then about 20 years ago, according to my CEO, was big in the founding of immuno-oncology.
Mhm.
She was hysterical because she says, yeah, they would put us down at the last every meeting. They would put us down in the last lecture hall at the last day, and it wasn't until Jim Allison won the Nobel Prize for CTLA4 did sort of this whole thing explode. And Li-Ping Chen, who's our academic lab,
Mhm.
discovered PD-1 and PDL1. And so this whole um, class of drugs called checkpoint inhibitors sort of came to be.
Mhm.
And they're really great. If you express the right ligands, they're really great drugs and they give a durable response to cancer.
Mhm.
So if you can get the immune system into a tumor, because that's what every day, all day, we're making mutated cancer cells and your
Yeah.
immune system just gets rid of them. And if you can get the immune system into the tumor, then you can eliminate the tumor.
Mhm.
But tumors are very crafty and they have all sorts of surveillance systems to sort of put up a shield so that the immune system can't get out.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's a field that's really sort of still up and coming. So Li Ping thinks that there are things that are normalizers that'll help normalize the tumor microenvironment. And this goes against most of the sort of dogma of cancer research.
Mhm.
So he's always been sort of a pioneer in this field of things. And he thinks that there's something called a T cell excluder. And we're not really sure what it is, but we have some thoughts about it, and that's what we're developing now. But there's also other companies now that are trying to come up with other strategies to destroy tumors with these T cell engagers. So they make antibodies that will have a target of interest on one arm. So an antibody sort of like this, and then direct it towards a T cell. I
Right.
think Amgen just came the last week, came out with a drug for small cell lung cancer, which is one of those cancers that there was no treatment for besides chemo until
Right.
recently.
So you,
Uh,
I mean, because you work in immuno-oncology, you're
mm.
speaking to your experience, but you're saying a lot of the current developments are going to treating cancer, specifically like tumors, in a different manner other than chemotherapy, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of things. So now they're trying to come up with cancer vaccines, which will also harness the immune system. There's
Okay.
CAR T. I don't know if you've heard of all that. And
What is CAR T?
that's when they take your immune cells out and they genetically modify them, and
Oh,
then
okay.
they to be able to attack your specific cancer, and they put them back in. And
Okay.
it works relatively well for liquid tumors, so
Hmm.
blood cancers.
Oh, I
Not
understand.
so good in solid tumors.
Hmm. Interesting.
But I think there's a lot that's up and coming. And you can even tie in the microbiome again. So we're back to our nutrition, that they found that some of these checkpoint inhibitor drugs work better if you have better gut bugs.
Mm.
then
And that's related to your nutrition too, as well.
so it always comes full circle. So
Yeah.
everything now in inflammation. So I mean, maybe I'm switching gears now, but chronic disease, which mostly is driven by an inflammatory process. So it's low grade smoldering inflammation. Your body needs inflammation if you get a cut or a
Mhm.
wound and an infection. So things go in, you get a, swelling and and stuff. But most people, because of their bad diet or not ideal diet, have an underlying inflammatory response that's going on chronically. And
Mhm.
that's where you get type 2 diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, all of these things
Mhm.
that are a lifestyle event
Yeah.
that, and there's a lot of research now in, well, one, the microbiome, because we've found out that the 3 trillion bugs that live in your belly,
Mhm.
more bugs on you than in you than cells that you actually have, drive everything from your health to your mood to your weight.
Mhm.
Because they're there and they're metabolizing your food too.
Yeah.
And those metabolites are what go through your bloodstream
Mhm.
and bind to different receptors as well. So it's
Yeah.
really a fascinating
Yeah.
field that is really still in its infancy.
That's interesting that you bring that up because I know how essential like gut bacteria are, and I know that there's like a lot of research that's going into that. But do you also think that maybe, and the studies that I've read, it seems like there's an increasing prevalence in cancer nowadays. Um, and with those increasing trends of cancer, do you think that that is contributing to advances in the immuno-oncology field, or do you think it's maybe just that we have like more tools to look at systems now than we did not before, or is it like a mix between the two factors, or what do you think? Like, what's really advancing the progression of this field?
I think I think it's, well, technology as that moves forward, always advances happen faster.
Right.
People are realizing that immuno-oncology is a real thing and not just sort of a fad thing
Mm.
anymore. So I think they're really seeing the value in having your own body fight something
Yeah.
that's not supposed to be there.
Mhm.
And obviously, chemo and radiation don't always work and make
Mhm.
people really sick.
Yeah, and they take a toll on the patients who have to have those treatments too, like physically and mentally.
Right,
Quite
right,
strenuous. Yeah. So, I mean, if there are other options out there, I'm sure that that would be really great to look into, just like you're doing. Um,
right, right.
just to close off, I wanted to also talk about because I think it's so interesting. Because outside of your academic and industry roles, you also own the Weekend Kitchen, which I just think is so unique and interesting. Um, could you like tell us a little bit more about your passion for it and how it complements your work in academia and industry, and how do you balance that with your schedule? Seems like you're very busy with 70 mice. How do you manage to do all of that? And I know that you also partake in like classes as well. So how does all that work together?
So about 18 years ago now, I was a postdoc, a poor postdoc, and I needed another form of income. And
Mhm.
my husband was working at the Mystic Seaport, which is a maritime history place, and he used to sail on tall ships. But we decided that we were going to open up a business that he could run.
Mhm.
Okay, so that was kind of a joke because he never ran it. So I've always run it behind the scenes,
Mhm.
and I'm there on the weekends. So I've always liked to shop, so it seemed like it was a good thing to try to get into. And if I didn't have to devote too much time, and there's always downtime in an experiment. You're running something, you got 20 minutes, I can go on the computer and order a bunch of stuff that's delivered to the store.
Yeah.
So that sort of went along, and then I hired people to work in the store. But along the line, everybody was like, "Oh, do you do cooking classes?" And I was like, "Well, no, where would I do them?" So we
Mhm.
ended up putting an addition on our house with a big kitchen,
Wow.
and it sort of started slowly where I found one chef, and then I would get two people to sign up and pay money, and then I'd have to get my friends to come in and fit, for bodies as filler.
Yeah. Yeah.
And little by little, it caught on. So, people would tell their friends, "Oh, I went to this great thing."
That's
Um,
awesome.
and because what's more unifying than food
For
and
sure.
sharing a meal,
Yeah.
and I try to keep everything really healthy. And we do a lot of vegan classes or plant forward classes.
Great.
So during COVID, it got to be the point where some of my chefs couldn't get here or one was sick. So I thought, I have to start teaching these myself.
Hmm.
So I really enjoy teaching them. And I tell people right up front, oh, I did a Ruby plant-based chef certification during COVID. So I'm a certified plant-based chef. So I'm not really a charlatan. But right up front, I tell people that I'm a scientist
Yeah.
and that I run it like a lab class. Because I figured I taught a lot of lab classes as a TA, right?
Yeah.
So I tell them, what's the difference between a recipe and a protocol to do an experiment? Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
Still a written thing you got to follow. And sometimes I even do my recipes like a flow chart, like I
Yeah.
was doing it. So then I talk about, the mise en place is getting everything in its place. And then I also like to bring in all of the nutritional things. So if we're using a lot of herbs, I talk about antioxidants and this and that. And I'm also very interested in food and food history.
Mhm.
So like some cultural things, like we're and we did an Indian class, and I had to talk about asafoetida, and we
Mhm.
pass that around, and where historically they come from, geographically things come from. So it makes it a sort of a cohesive
Yeah.
experience for them,
I
and
think
it's fun.
that's
And then we get to eat the experiment at the end.
yeah, exactly. You get to eat it. You don't do that normally, but yeah, no, I think that's great because I mean, like you're offering so many different options, like to adapt to people's like dietary preferences, even between like vegan options versus non-vegan. I think that's great, even culturally too, because if you go to a cooking class, sometimes someone's from a different culture, it might be hard for them to incorporate those like meals that they've learned daily if that really like contrasts with their culture. So I think that that's great that you're teaching a wide variety of options to be inclusive of everyone. I think that's great.
Plus, home cooking is sort of the key to good health
Mm-hmm.
because you're eating more of a whole food diet. You're not eating ultra processed stuff. People, I find that they think they're so busy that they go out and grab something that's really full of sugar and salt and processed things, and really that is driving our chronic diseases more than anything else.
Yes, you're
So
trying to teach a healthier, faster alternative.
right, right. I also did a culinary coaching certification through Harvard Medical School,
Yeah.
which instead of like my health coaching, you can direct them and ask them more pointed questions like, do you have knives to do the chopping and everything? So I'm sort of setting myself up for my retirement career
Mm.
because I figure people shouldn't have to use my therapeutic that I'm discovering in the lab. They shouldn't be getting cancer to begin with. So if I can keep people healthy and eating well and staving off, these, what does Peter Attia call it, the horsemen, um, um, that will come and bring you away, bring you away. So if you don't get cancer, you won't need the therapeutic. So if I can keep you healthy by eating good food, um, maybe I can help in that respect. And everybody needs accountability and a
Yes.
plan.
I see, yes, your background in immunology and nutritional biochemistry is, yeah, like you said, is really coming full circle here. That's really interesting. I really like appreciate you taking the time to also come on this podcast and your busy schedule. Um, and yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I think that that concludes our episode for today. Um, and thank you so much, Dr. Hercules.
You're very welcome. It was fun.